Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. Hey, tonight we're diving into a fascinating journey through one of history's darkest yet most transformative periods, the time of the Black Death, what it was like to survive this devastating plague. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine this. Congratulations. You've just woken up in Europe in the year 1347. The morning air is crisp and sharp as it slips into your lungs, stirring you from restless sleep. You stretch on your straw-filled mattress, coarse and uneven beneath your body. You're not alone, but you're not in comfort. This one-room cottage holds your entire family, sharing the same thin walls, the same struggles. The walls around you are made of wattle and daub, a fragile wooden frame packed tightly with mud, clay, and straw. Though rough and humble, it fights off the biting cold outside. Yet, when the rains come, the thatched roof groans and leaks, drops falling onto the bare floor below. As you rise, your senses fill with the life of your world. The smoky haze from last night's hearthfire still lingers, wrapping the room in a warm, flickering glow. The earthy scent of the dirt floor mingles with the distinct, unwashed smell of bodies who rarely find the luxury of a proper bath. Bathing is a rarity, a forgotten comfort in these times. And no one minds because here everyone shares the same heavy scent of survival. Your stomach rumbles, hunger gnaws at your insides. Maybe, just maybe, a piece of yesterday's bread remains, now hard as stone. You'll soak it in some weak ale. Yes, even children drink ale, for it's safer than water, which hides unseen dangers capable of stealing life with a single sip. Outside, life stirs. You catch faint sounds of cattle lowing in distant fields, the cluck of restless chickens, and the voices of neighbors already at work, greeting the dawn. Most here are peasants, tied to the land, bound by duty and necessity, free tenants paying rent, or serfs shackled by obligations to the local lord. The rhythm of life beats steady, measured by the rise and fall of the sun, the toll of church bells summoning prayers, and the unyielding cycle of planting and harvest. It's a hard, relentless life, but it's all you've ever known. What you do not know, what no one in Europe yet understands, is that a shadow is creeping across the continent. A shadow darker than famine, fiercer than any war. A shadow that will unravel your world and remake it in ways no one could imagine. The first whispers arrive on the lips of a traveling merchant. He carries goods from distant lands, shimmering silks, fragrant spices, but also dark news. Stories whispered in fearful tones, cities falling to a sickness, mysterious and merciless. People are dying by the thousands, he says, eyes haunted. Fever, swellings that burst with agony, death swift and certain. Some villagers cross themselves, whisper prayers to saints who seem silent. Others shake their heads, dismissing these tales as exaggeration. After all, rumors have a way of growing like wildfire, spreading fear faster than truth. But this time, the fire is real. And it's coming. The merchant moves on, and for a while, life continues in a fragile rhythm that mimics normalcy. But unease is growing, whispers carried on the wind, stories that begin like rumors and end in trembling silence. With each passing month, the tales become more vivid, more terrifying. By the time autumn arrives, they are no longer quiet murmurs, they are cries of dread echoing from distant shores. The sickness has reached the Mediterranean ports, Messina, Marseille, Venice. Ships drift into harbors like ghost vessels, their sails sagging and decks silent, filled not with goods, but with the bodies of men who never reached their destination. God save us all, your mother whispers, barely audible, crossing herself with hands that shake more than they used to. Her voice carries something deeper than fear, something closer to grief for a world she senses is about to vanish. In your village, people prepare. Not with certainty, but with desperation. Some hoard food in their cellars, as if grain and salt could keep death at bay. Others kneel longer in church pews, seeking safety in prayer, clinging to the belief that holiness might grant immunity. The village healer, with eyes that have seen too much already, gathers herbs with shaking fingers, not knowing if anything in her satchel can hold back what's coming. Winter creeps in like a warning. And then the first report arrives from a neighboring village no more than half a day's walk away. Several have died, quickly, terribly. High fevers, endless thirst, swellings the size of apples in the soft, hidden parts of their bodies, underarms and groins. Most were gone within 3 days. The elders gather, there is shouting, silence, grief. Some plead to shut the village gates, to seal themselves in and the world out. Others insist on keeping trade routes open, arguing that to stop living is to surrender to death before it arrives. In the end, there is no real answer, just a decision to carry on. But the air is heavier now, the days are edged with dread. Then one morning, the stillness breaks. A young man from the mill doesn't show up for work. They find him drenched in sweat, his eyes glazed, his body twisted with fever. A bubo, a swollen lump the size of a hen's egg, rises angrily on his neck. The plague has arrived. What follows is not just disease, it is devastation. It is terror made flesh. People fall ill with terrifying speed. One day they are laughing in the market. By the next they are in bed, eyes wild, mouths dry with thirst. By the third they are often gone. The black swellings, angry grotesque, are agony itself. Some begin to cough blood, the sickness having sunk into their lungs. Those ones rarely live to see another dawn. It's God's wrath, some cry, whipping their own backs, trying to bleed out their guilt with every stroke. It's the air. It's poisoned, others say, pressing flowers to their faces, desperate to believe that scent can keep the darkness away. And then, in bitter whispers, it's the Jews. They poison the wells. But your village has no Jewish families. Still, fear does not care for truth. It only needs a target. And so your world begins to unravel. Not all at once, but steadily, cruelly. Not just from disease, but from panic, from loss, from the unbearable grief of watching everything familiar fall to pieces. And yet, such accusations hold no weight. Not now, not in the light of truth we possess centuries later. The real cause, unknown to any soul in the 14th century, is a microscopic killer, a bacterium named Yersinia pestis. Invisible to the eye, yet powerful enough to topple civilizations, it journeys inside the gut of fleas, which cling to the backs of rats. These rats, ever-present stowaways on ships and silent shadows in the corners of medieval towns and villages, have unknowingly become messengers of death, carrying it across borders, across oceans, into homes. When an infected flea bites a human, it does more than feed. It injects terror into flesh, regurgitating the bacteria into the wound. What follows is swift and merciless. The bacteria multiply, and the body erupts in pain. Lymph nodes swell into grotesque, tender lumps, the infamous buboes. And if the infection reaches the lungs, it transforms into something worse. Pneumonic plague, airborne and ravenous, passing from breath to breath, a whisper of death in every cough. But you know none of this. All you know is that people are dying everywhere, and no one can explain why. No one can stop it. Your village, like countless others, feels like it's unraveling. Church bells, once a gentle rhythm of daily life, calling you to prayer, to weddings, to moments of stillness, now toll endlessly for the dead, until one day they don't. Not because death has ended, but because there are so simply too many to count, too many to grieve. Gone are the sacred rituals of farewell. Now the dead are buried hurriedly, without prayer, without ceremony, without time to weep. Bodies are hauled in carts to mass graves. In homes where death has taken everyone, no one remains to close the eyes of the departed. Neighbors, numb or terrified, may come days later to remove the corpses, sometimes not at all. Fear seeps into everything. It changes the way people look at one another. Healthy families bar their doors, not out of cruelty, but desperation. The sick are left alone. Some people flee, believing the countryside might offer safety. Others fall to their knees in the streets, whipping their own backs in bloody pleas for forgiveness from a God they believe has turned his face away. Even the priests, once beacons of solace, are dying too fast to bless the dead. Many abandon their posts, unable to face the unstoppable tide. Others stay and are buried among their flock, and yet, somehow, your family remains untouched. For now. You pray, you hope, you breathe with caution, watching death encircle your village like a tightening noose. You've heard the stories, whole households gone in days, children left motherless only to follow her into the grave, lovers torn apart hours after swearing forever, And deep inside, a quiet dread builds, because no one is truly safe. One morning, your little brother says he's cold. You place a hand to his forehead and feel the heat of a rising fever. By midday, he can barely lift his head. By nightfall, you see it, the swelling, angry and dark, rising beneath his jaw. And in that moment, everything inside you breaks, because you know what it means. Your mother tends to him day and night, her hands trembling as she bathes his fevered brow with cool cloths. Her eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, never stop scanning his face for signs of change. She coaxes him to take small sips of water or weak ale, whispering encouragements, even as her voice breaks with fear. Your father speaks in hushed tones about taking him to the monastery, where the monks are said to care for the sick. But everyone knows the truth. Those sacred halls are no longer sanctuaries. They are overwhelmed, many of the brothers now lying silent beneath plague-ridden sheets themselves. For 3 unbearable days, your brother grows worse. The angry boil swells, darkens. First red, then the deep black of rot. His breath comes in ragged gasps. He cries out in pain and confusion, calling names, pleading with ghosts. You take turns sitting beside him, like though the dread that grips your chest whispers for you to stay away. Still, love roots your feet to the floor. You cannot abandon him. And then, on the 4th day, something shifts. Most at this stage are lost, taken swiftly by the sickness. But not him. His fever breaks. He sleeps shallow and still, and when he opens his eyes again, he is lucid. Diminished, yes. Frighteningly weak, but present. The boil hasn't vanished, but it has softened. Days pass, and it ruptures, draining. The sight is foul, but to your family, it is hope made visible. Your brother, against all odds, is among the precious few who will survive the Black Death. You do not yet know why. No one does. But centuries later, science will uncover a mystery of nature, a rare genetic mutation called Delta 32. It alters a protein, CCR5, on white blood cells, forming a kind of barricade. The plague's deadly bacterium cannot easily penetrate it. It cannot take hold. Your brother may carry this invisible armor. So too might others in your bloodline. This strange, silent quirk of biology, a gift given without reason, grants survival to some in a time when death shows no mercy. And somehow, impossibly, this same mutation will one day offer resistance to another invisible killer, HIV, a disease humanity would not even name for another 6 centuries. The Black Death, without meaning to, will have sown the seeds of resilience in generations to come. But that is not your concern now. For now, your family gathers in the dim light of your home, weeping not in grief, but in disbelief, in wonder, in awe. Your brother lives. He lives. And though there are no answers, there is gratitude, raw and overwhelming. Not everyone is so fortunate. As the weeks roll on, the plague does not loosen its grip. Your village, once echoing with laughter and song, now falls quiet. Of 200 souls, fewer than half remain. The fields grow wild, untended. Those still living are too busy nursing the dying or burying their kin. The rhythm of life has broken. Even the Lord in the stone house atop the hill is not spared. He has lost his wife, 2 of his children. His wealth, his fine linens, his walls of stone, none of it protected him. None of it mattered. The Black Death is blind to status. It takes the humble and the noble alike. And for those who remain, survival is no longer just about escaping death. It is about making meaning from the ruin it leaves behind. Strangely, some people seem untouched by the plague, as if they walk through death without consequence. The village gravedigger, an unpleasant, cold man known for stealing from the dead, handles the lifeless bodies of plague victims each day. He breathes their last breaths, touches their ruined flesh, yet remains symptomless. No cough, no fever, no signs of the illness that's consumed the rest of the village. And then there's the midwife. She moves between childbirth and death, caring for the sick with worn hands and weary eyes, risking everything. Yet the sickness spares her too. Like your brother, perhaps they carry something invisible, a hidden shield passed down in blood, something the people of that time couldn't name, so they turned to the only explanations they knew, the will of God, or whispers of unholy protection. Survival could look like a miracle, or a curse. As the months drag on, food becomes harder to find. Fields are left empty, their crops withering from neglect. The roads grow quiet, trade slows to a whisper. Hunger sharpens into desperation. A loaf of bread becomes a luxury. Remedies, herbs, relics, even superstition are sold at impossible prices or vanish entirely. Hope is rationed like grain, and then, just as suddenly as it came, the plague retreats with the cold. Winter brings a stillness, not a victory, just a pause. Fleas become sluggish, rats hide away, and people begin to breathe again. Their grief still raw, but their hearts daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare is ending. But spring arrives with betrayal, the sun returns, and with it the plague. Stronger, quicker, as if it remembers where it left off. It comes for those who buried the first dead, for those who had dared to hope. Over the next 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, the waves will keep crashing. Europe will lose between 75 and 200 million souls, nearly half its people. Entire villages will vanish. Families will disappear. The world will not recover. It will become something else. In the aftermath, the world reshapes itself. With so many gone, the old rules begin to crumble. The feudal system fractures, labor becomes precious, and peasants discover they have leverage. A quiet revolution begins. Faith begins to unravel, too. People question the silence of heaven. They wonder why priests fled, why prayers were ignored, why holiness offered no protection. Medicine, rooted in superstition and the writings of ancient men, fails, and its failure cannot be denied. Those who survive, your brother, the gravedigger, the midwife, are forever changed. They live on, yes, but survival is not the same as salvation. They will carry the grief of 1,000 losses. They will look around at a world they no longer recognize and feel the weight of rebuilding something new from the ruins of everything they once knew. And still they go on. They are the ones who will shape what comes next, not just with tools or trade, but with questions, with memories, with scars. They are the witnesses, the remnants, the reluctant architects of a world forever altered by death. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a post-plague world begins to take shape, one that, for better or worse, will steer Europe toward a future no one could yet imagine. But that is a story for another night. For now, as sleep gently tugs at the edges of your awareness, picture yourself as one of those weary survivors standing at the edge of a quiet village as dusk falls. The first stars pierce the fading sky, soft and distant, like a promise whispered in the dark. The plague has moved on, at least for now. You are still here. You have endured what felt like the unraveling of the world, and though you cannot see it yet, you are standing on sacred ground, where endings and beginnings meet. A world has died, and from its ashes something new is stirring. Your breath rises and falls in the hush of night, blending with the murmur of a distant dog, the rustling leaves, the soft hush of wind through the trees. Despite the hollow places grief has carved into your soul, despite the faces you will never see again, life continues. And in that quiet, ordinary truth lies the most extraordinary lesson of all, that we as a species carry an astonishing resilience. We bend, we break, we mourn, and still we rise, we adapt, we move forward. The morning after your brother's fever breaks feels unreal, like a dream you're afraid to believe in. Relief washes over you in warm, disorienting waves. But there's something else too, something quieter, a weight pressing behind your ribs. Why him? Why your family when so many others were lost? It's not gratitude alone that fills you, it's survivor's guilt, raw and confusing. A grief born not only of what was lost, but of what was spared. Your brother's eyes, once glazed with fever, now look back at you with fragile clarity. He is alive, but changed. The drained bubo at his throat has left a cruel scar. It will never fully fade. But a scar is a testament, a story etched into flesh, a reminder that he came so close to leaving and didn't. A scar, after all, is infinitely better than a grave. And so every moment of his slow return to life is treasured. Every bite he eats, every step he takes, every word he whispers feels like a miracle you dared not ask for. One night, as the fire crackles low and silence wraps around your family like a worn blanket, he turns to you and asks, voice thin, barely above a breath, "Why did I live when so many died?" There is no answer, only the truth that remains after all the questions. You lived, he lived. And now, somehow, you begin again. Your mother pauses, the flicker of a rush candle dancing in her weary eyes as twilight swallows the day. "God's will," she murmurs at last. But the way her voice catches, soft, uncertain, betrays the weight behind those words, as if faith is something she's still trying to convince herself of. Of course, the truth, unknowable in the 14th century, is far more intricate, far more haunting. Throughout our history, invisible enemies have shaped our fate. Infectious diseases, ruthless and indifferent, act as silent architects of evolution. They do not choose whom to spare out of mercy, but out of chance. Those with hidden strengths, genetic quirks that shield them, are the ones who live to tell the tale. The Black Death is perhaps the most brutal and decisive force of this kind in all of human memory. Somewhere deep within your brother's body, and maybe within your own, a single mutation whispers a quiet defiance against death. It alters a tiny protein, CCR5, sitting like a gatekeeper on the surface of his white blood cells. When changed by what scientists centuries later will call the Delta 32 mutation, this gate becomes a locked door, a barrier, a resistance. The plague cannot easily pass. Some people carry one copy of this mutation. It helps, but not enough. A rare few have two. Those few stand like lighthouses in a storm, and your brother, it seems, is one of them. But evolution never gives without taking. The price of this so-called advantage has been paid by millions. Millions who did not have the mutation. Millions who withered under fever, whose breath stopped in silence, who died not because they were weak, but because they were unprotected. Randomness, dressed in biology. Now, as your brother steps outside for the first time since his brush with death, the village he returns to feels like a memory unraveling. Gardens once lovingly tended are choked with weeds. Windows stare blankly from homes left hollow. The blacksmith's hammer has fallen quiet. The weaver's loom stands still. Even the miller's wheel, once the heartbeat of daily life, is motionless. Yet in the stillness, something stirs. Not just survival, resilience. Market day returns, smaller, quieter, but alive. Farmers arrive, weary and sunburned, their carts filled with whatever the soil still offers. A lone merchant appears, cloak dusty, eyes sharp, braving the silence with salt, spices, and distant rumors. The news he carries is grim but familiar. Devastation, followed by the trembling beginnings of recovery. No place has been spared. Cities crumble under the weight of their own closeness. Disease thrived in the filth and breath of 1,000 neighbors packed tight, but even the remote have not escaped. Mountain villages and forest clearings, places thought untouchable, they too have their ghosts. And yet here you stand, not untouched, not unbroken, but still breathing. In your region, perhaps half the population has vanished, swallowed by a silence that still echoes in every empty home, every overgrown field. In some places, the devastation is worse. The merchant speaks with a haunted edge, describing ghost towns where not a single heartbeat remains, monasteries where every monk lies lifeless in his cell, untouched prayers still hanging in the air, entire noble bloodlines gone, their great halls and manicured estates now ruled by dust and wind. And yet, not all is despair. He also speaks of resilience, of quiet courage blooming in unlikely places, of villages pulling together, bound not by law or lord, but by the raw instinct to care for one another, of neighbors who open their doors to orphans, of hands that still reach out even in grief, unexpected kindness in a world unraveling. Then he shares a story that pierces straight through the numbness of survival. In a village not unlike yours, a woman named Elizabeth lost everything, her husband and 6 children, in the span of a single week. One by one, she carried their bodies to a hill behind their cottage and buried them herself. No one helped. No one could. And still, she did not fall ill, like your brother, like the gravedigger. She seemed untouchable, held in some invisible grace, what future generations would come to know as genetic resistance. They say she's a witch, the merchant whispers, glancing around though no one is near. How else could she touch the dead and live? Some called for her to be drowned, but most just silently thanked her, because while the rest wept and hid, she kept burying the dead, hers and theirs. Rumors, always ready to sprout in the cracks left by fear, thrive in times like these. Especially against those who defy the rules of fate, women alone, those who survive when others don't, those who are different. Superstition spreads like the plague itself, another contagion equally deadly in the right conditions. Your father listens quietly to the tale, then shakes his head, not in disbelief but in firm resolve. No witchcraft in survival, he says, voice low but steady. Some are simply stronger against the sickness, like my son. He rests a rough, calloused hand on your brother's shoulder, pride and sorrow mingling in the gesture like morning frost over warm earth. The merchant nods, always careful to agree. True enough, he says, in every village there are those the plague cannot touch. God's chosen, perhaps. Winter creeps in, early darkness, bitter wind, the hush of snowfall on half-empty streets. Your village begins to settle into a fragile rhythm. There are fewer mouths to feed now, a strange and painful mercy. But fewer hands too, fewer to split wood, tend the animals, patch the holes in roofs and hearts, and this changes things. Quietly, without fanfare, the balance of power begins to shift. Your father, once just another carpenter in a line of laborers, now finds himself courted. The lord who once barked commands now bargains, offering better pay for urgent work on the manor house. The plague took much, but it also left behind questions. And in the space where certainty once lived, new truths are beginning to take root. He offered me a silver penny for 3 days' work, your father tells your mother one evening, his voice hushed, almost disbelieving. And a side of bacon. His words hang in the air like something sacred. A silver penny, a side of bacon. Not long ago, such an offer, it would have seemed like a fantasy, a cruel joke. But now, in this world reshaped by loss, it is real and staggering. Your mother says nothing at first, only nods slowly, her hands stilling for a moment in her lap as the weight of it settles in. The world has changed. With half the craftsmen in the region gone, buried or burned or simply vanished, those who remain are no longer invisible. Their hands, once taken for granted, are now priceless. And your father, always quiet, always steady, carries something different in his step these days. Not pride exactly, but purpose. Maybe even hope. That shift echoes far beyond your home. Farm laborers, once overlooked and endlessly replaceable, now speak with voices a little stronger, stand a little taller, asking, demanding, wages that reflect their worth. Servants, especially women who know how to run a household with precision and grace, are courted by noble families whose estates lie silent and half-empty. And women, God the women, are stepping into spaces they were once forbidden to enter. Widows no longer rush to remarry. Why should they, when they've proven they can run a business, manage a household, survive alone? A woman in the next village picks up her husband's blacksmith hammer, her hands calloused from the work. Some whisper that it's shameful. But she feeds her children, she keeps the forge alive, and no one else dares to do what she does. Even the serfs, tied for generations to land they did not own, are tasting something new, the first breath of freedom. Desperate lords now offer promises once unthinkable. Stay, they say. Work my fields and I'll set you free. And if not, many walk away, toward towns, toward opportunity, toward a future that feels like it finally belongs to them. With so many dead, who is left to stop them? Of course, the old ways don't crumble in a day. The bones of the feudal order still hold, crooked and cracking, but they hold, for now. Yet in the silence that follows the plague, something has begun to shift. The world is stirring. The seeds of change are in the soil, and in your small corner of it, your family presses forward. Your brother grows stronger, though sometimes he stares at the fire too long, as if haunted by what he's seen. Your father's hands are rough with work, but he comes home with more coin, more food, more stories. He is still the same man, but in a world that finally sees him for what he is. Essential. You adjust, you survive, and quietly, with every breath, you begin to rebuild not just your life, but your place in this changed world. Your mother now takes in washing from the manor house, work that, for the first time, is paid fairly. Not because the nobility have become generous, but because so many hands have vanished. Death has created demand, and the world, however reluctantly, has had to adjust. You too find yourself stepping into a space that once would have been unimaginable for someone like you. The parish priest, one of the rare clergy who stayed when the world darkened, who neither fled nor fell, needs help maintaining the church's records. You can read and write thanks to your mother, who once worked in a noble household where letters mattered more than lineage. It was a quiet skill she passed to you, never knowing how much it might one day mean. As spring returns, it brings a fragile sense of renewal. The land begins to breathe again. Green shoots rise from the soil, birds return with their songs, wildflowers bloom where death recently lingered. But the warmth also carries a silent dread, because everyone remembers. Warm weather was when the plague first came. By early summer, that fear becomes fact. New cases emerge, fewer this time, yes, but each one slices through the heart of a community already stitched together by grief. Many of the dead were already mourned. Now the wounds tear open again. One quiet afternoon, seated beside the priest as you record yet another name in the parish death register, a document that feels more like a graveyard than paper. You finally ask the question that's been burning in your chest. Father, why did God send the plague? The priest pauses. His hands are stained with ink, his eyes with sorrow. Lines etch his face not only from age, but from what he's witnessed. He breathes slowly before answering. Some say it is punishment, he says, voice low. Others, a test of faith. The Pope has urged us to pray, to repent, to fast. But, he dips the quill again, I've seen holy men scream in pain, and thieves walk untouched. I've sat with dying children, so innocent they barely understood what suffering was. He doesn't look at you when he speaks the next words, as though ashamed of their weight. Maybe it's not for us to understand God's plan. His uncertainty mirrors the unspoken ache carried across villages and cities, whispered in the candlelight of chapels and kitchens alike. Because how do you believe in justice when the plague takes the kindest, the gentlest, the ones who prayed the hardest? Communities across Europe begin to echo that same silent crisis. The plague doesn't fit the story the church has always told. If this is divine wrath, why does it fall without discernment? If prayer is protection, why do monasteries become tombs? The church, once the great fortress of certainty, begins to show its cracks. Its answers falter under the weight of too many questions. Not just about suffering, but about who gets to speak for God. And just as religious faith begins to shake, so too does trust in medicine, or what little there is of it. This invisible enemy does not obey rituals or remedies. It mocks both prayer and poultice. In this space of not knowing, something stirs. It is not yet rebellion, not yet science, but it is the beginning of something deeper. A human hunger to understand the world not through fear, but through truth. Physicians, trained in the hallowed halls of the most prestigious universities, find themselves helpless in the face of the plague's brutal indifference. Their grand theories, woven from ancient notions of bodily humors and guided by the stars, crumble under the weight of reality. They cannot explain why one child recovers while another slips silently away, why one village endures while another is nearly erased. The plague does not respect intellect, nor learning, nor status. Some doctors rise to the moment, choosing courage over comfort. They walk willingly into homes heavy with the scent of death, knowing they may not walk out again. Their sacrifice is quiet, unseen, and often unremembered. Others, however, do not stay. At the first hint of illness, they vanish, guided not by ethics, but by fear. Their empty chairs tell a bitter truth. Even the healers are human. Those who remain take refuge in rituals and symbols of protection. They cloak themselves in strange, otherworldly garb, long-waxed robes, gloved hands, and the eerie beaked mask stuffed with herbs meant to cleanse the poisoned air. This iconic attire, so haunting in its appearance, offers little real defense. It is not armor. It is hope, stitched together by desperation. And so, where official remedies fail, communities begin to create their own forms of resistance. Some methods are born of superstition. Charms whispered into the wind, talismans clutched in trembling hands, suspicion cast upon black cats and red-haired neighbors. But other practices, grounded in common sense and hard-earned observation, prove more useful. The sick are isolated, their possessions burned. Cleanliness becomes sacred. These actions, though imperfect, carry weight. They buy time, they save lives. In your village, such measures become part of daily life. Doors of the afflicted are marked with white crosses, stark against aging wood. Outsiders are held in a quarantine hut, watched with wary eyes for days. The dead are buried quickly, without song, without ritual, just earth and silence. Their belongings fed to fire, not memory. These precautions matter. They slow the shadow, but they do not stop it. By midsummer, the village mourns a dozen more souls, each name a hollow space where laughter once lived. Among the fallen is the lord of the manor himself, who had survived the first wave, only to be claimed by the second. His death sends tremors through the fragile structure of local life. The heir, his son, barely past boyhood, returns from the learned courts of Paris. He steps into a world his father could never have prepared him for. But perhaps, in his youth and education, lies a rare gift. The ability to see that the world has changed and will not change back. He does not cling to the past. He listens. He adapts. In the absence of hands to till the land, he offers freedom to those willing to stay. He lowers rents. He honors skill, not birth. Your father, once just another laborer, is now recognized as a craftsman, respected, essential, free. Not all nobles show such wisdom. In neighboring manors, fear breeds cruelty. Old laws are enforced with violence. Hope is crushed beneath the boot of tradition. But these efforts falter. The world that was cannot hold, because something deeper is shifting. Beneath the grief and the ash, a quiet revolution takes root. Not one of swords and banners, but of choices and chances. Of people once voiceless now beginning to shape the story of what comes next. Peasants simply leave, seeking better conditions elsewhere. With land abundant and workers scarce, they find no shortage of opportunities. The plague's second wave finally recedes with the coming of autumn. Your village has survived, diminished but intact. Of the original 200 residents, perhaps 90 remain. Fields have been consolidated, with the most fertile land prioritized for cultivation. Houses stand empty, their timbers and thatch gradually scavenged for other uses. Yet life has a remarkable capacity to normalize even after catastrophe. Children play in the village square again. The rhythms of agricultural life, planting, tending, harvesting, continue, adapted to the reduced workforce. Weddings take place, babies are born, commerce resumes. One clear autumn day, a surprising visitor arrives in the village, a mason who had left years before to seek work in the cities. He had built a good life in Florence, he tells anyone who will listen, working on the magnificent cathedral there. But when the plague struck, it devastated the city worse than any rural area. I watched half of Florence die, he says, his eyes haunted by memories. The rich fled to their country estates, but the poor had nowhere to go. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. I survived, God knows how. After the worst passed, work on the cathedral halted. With so many dead, priorities shifted to essential rebuilding. The mason, finding himself without steady employment, decided to return to his birthplace. His story is not unique. Throughout Europe, the plague causes a temporary reversal of the centuries-long trend of urbanization. Cities, with their crowded conditions, are perfect breeding grounds for disease. Many who survive flee to the countryside, seeking safety in open spaces and smaller communities. This urban exodus brings unexpected benefits to rural villages like yours. People return with new skills, new ideas, and new perspectives gained from their time in cities. They bring tales of different ways of living, of technological innovations, and of political systems unlike the feudal structure of rural areas. The Mason, for instance, describes how Florence was governed not by a hereditary noble, but by elected officials from the merchant class. He speaks of mechanical clocks that divide the day into precise hours, of water management systems that bring clean water into the city, and of banking practices that allow trade across vast distances. These ideas find fertile ground in communities already questioning traditional authorities and practices. The plague has created cracks in the medieval worldview, and through these cracks, new possibilities emerge. For you and your family, life continues in this altered landscape. Your brother, fully recovered, though scarred by his encounter with the plague, apprentices to the returned mason, learning the skilled craft that will provide him a secure future in a world where such skills are increasingly valued. Your father's carpentry now brings in enough to keep the family not just secure, but comfortable. His hands, once undervalued, now paid in silver for skills that are suddenly precious in a world stripped bare. Your mother no longer scrubs clothes for wealthier households. Instead, she tends to her herb garden, her fingers coaxing life from the soil, producing remedies that people seek with desperate hope now that so many healers are gone. And you, once just another peasant child, spend your days beside the priest, recording baptisms, deaths, land grants. Your literacy, once a curious anomaly, is now a lifeline for the community. In the old world, your birth would have sealed your path. But in this new, broken world, need outweighs custom. Ability rises where lineage once ruled. One evening, as firelight flickers across the walls and the scent of roasted onions fills the air, your family gathers around a meal richer than you would have ever imagined before the plague. There is meat. There is bread still warm from the hearth. There is enough. Your father sets down his cup, his voice quiet. "It's a terrible thing to say," he begins, eyes lowered. "But for those of us who survived, life is better now." Your mother nods slowly, her gaze distant. More food, better pay, more freedom. And yet, underneath her words lies the weight of truth. This new world is built on the silence of the dead. That's the cruel paradox. For the ones left behind, whether by fate, by fortune, or by hidden strength in their blood, the world has opened. Social walls once thought immovable have crumbled. There is space to rise, space to breathe, but every gain is shadowed by what was lost. Families vanished, friends buried in haste, songs never sung again, recipes forgotten, stories untold. The price of your survival is not measured only in lives, but in the irreplaceable fabric of what once was. And you know, deep down, that no feast, no coin, no title could ever balance that scale. As you lie in bed that night, listening to the wind outside your window, your mind drifts to what lies ahead. The plague is quiet now, but no one believes it is gone for good. Like a beast in the forest, it will return. It always does. But so too will humanity. Scarred, but not broken. Changed, but enduring. Each wave of sickness will push the world closer to understanding. Each loss will whisper a lesson to those who remain. You do not yet know that you are living at a hinge in history, that the Renaissance, the great flowering of art, science, and thought, is already stirring in the ashes, that the iron grip of feudalism has begun to loosen, that questions once unthinkable are being asked quietly, but with growing courage. And deep within your blood, and that of your brother and kin, the plague has written its legacy, altering the human story at its root, shaping not just lives, but the very biology of generations yet to come. This is not just a recovery, it is a rebirth. But like all births, it begins in pain. Your brother's survival, though it feels like a fragile miracle, is more than just personal fortune. It is a quiet thread in the vast, unfolding tapestry of human resilience, a moment where biology and fate align. His body, like yours, like so many others, is unknowingly participating in an evolutionary chapter, humanity's ongoing dance with the unseen world of microbes. Some of those microbes nurture life, others try to extinguish it. And yet, again and again, we endure. Tomorrow, when the sun rises over your altered world, there will be no celebration. Only silence, labor, and the slow return of breath to lungs that have held too much grief. You will continue, because that is what survivors do. You will rebuild, adapt, and find a way forward through the wreckage of what once was. And as you do, you carry with you the weight of memory, of those lost, of all that was endured. But you also carry a quiet hope. Because to survive is not merely to remain alive, it is to shape the world anew. Every choice, every kindness, every step into tomorrow becomes part of a legacy that will echo far beyond your time. The story of survival we've followed, your story, is not the only one. It's part of a larger narrative stretching across centuries, a story of perseverance, of unexpected courage, of inherited strength written in blood and bone. And now, as sleep gently overtakes you and the ache of the day begins to soften, let us travel forward to a new chapter, a new village, another moment suspended in time. 300 years have passed since the first dark tide of the Black Death swept through Europe. The year is 1665. We find ourselves in a small village tucked into the green, rolling hills of Derbyshire, England. Pronounced simply like M, is quiet and self-sufficient. Its people are farmers, miners, craftsmen. They rise with the sun to tend their fields and livestock, laboring in rhythm with the land. Their lives are ordinary, shaped by the earth beneath them and the sky above. They gather on Sundays in the stone sanctuary of St. Lawrence's Church. They meet at the tavern after long days to share news, laughter, and ale. They know each other's faces, each other's stories. Generations have lived and died on this land, stitching a tight fabric of kinship and care. It is a place where no one is truly a stranger. But all of that is about to change. What the villagers of do not yet know is that their peaceful routines will soon be shattered by a force as invisible and deadly as the one their ancestors once faced. The plague has returned to England. In the crowded, grimy streets of London, the Old Terror, still known to many as the Black Death, is claiming lives with ruthless speed. By the time it finishes its cruel work, it will have taken 100,000 souls from the capital alone, nearly a quarter of the city's population. This new outbreak will be remembered as the Great Plague of London. It will mark the final major surge of bubonic plague in England. For now, though, sleeps soundly. The villagers believe their remoteness will keep them safe. The plague, they say, is a city problem. a horror of the crowded markets and dirty alleys, not the clean hills and quiet lanes of rural Derbyshire. But history has a way of finding even the hidden corners. And soon, will be asked to make a choice that will define its legacy, not just in records or books, but in the hearts of all who hear what happened there. The test is coming, and so is the sacrifice. But fate has other plans. In late August of 1665, a seemingly ordinary package arrives in addressed to the local tailor, Alexander Hadfield. It holds a bundle of cloth from London, perhaps beautiful, rare fabric meant to bring the latest fashions to the countryside. The parcel travels far, its journey long and damp, and it carries with it more than thread and textile. It carries death. George Vikers, Hadfield's assistant and a lodger in his home, opens the parcel. He notices the cloth is wet from travel, so he hangs it by the fire to dry. He has no reason to suspect anything, no reason to fear. But as the warmth spreads through the fabric, something stirs. Fleas, buried deep within its folds, awaken, and with them, the plague. In the days that follow, George grows ill. A violent fever grips him. Swollen lumps, buboes, rise in his neck and under his arms. Painful, unmistakable. The village watches with growing dread as the strong, healthy young man wastes away. On September 7th, 1665, George Vikers dies, the first victim in Panic sets in like fog rolling down the hills. 4 more die before the month ends, all of them from homes near where Vikers lived. The disease has taken hold. The village has been marked, and autumn brings no mercy. More fall ill. The sound of weeping becomes a constant undertone in the village air. Families bury 2, 3, sometimes 4 loved ones in a single week. The graveyard fills faster than hands can dig. Despair tightens its grip. The natural response is escape. Flee before it's too late. In London, King Charles II and the nobility have already abandoned the city for safer ground. In the wealthier families begin to pack their belongings, readying for the same. Surely no one can blame them. After all, who wouldn't run from the shadow of death? And yet, in the heart of this terror, 2 voices rise. William Mompesson, Iam's newly appointed rector, and Thomas Stanley, his predecessor. 2 men of God, once divided by religious ideology, Mompesson of the Church of England, Stanley, a Puritan, now united by a deeper calling, to protect not just their flock, but all those beyond it. Together, they propose something almost unthinkable, a self-imposed quarantine. No one in, no one out. The village will become its own prison, a wall of humanity holding back the plague. They ask the impossible, for people to stay, knowing it may mean death, so that others outside these borders might live. It is not just a strategy, it is a sacrifice, a surrender of escape, a quiet, collective heroism. And somehow, astonishingly, the villagers say yes. In that moment, a small village chooses courage over fear. They choose love for strangers they will never meet, over the instinct for self-preservation. They choose to make meaning of their suffering, even as the darkness closes in, and in doing so, they write a story the world will never forget. The village boundary becomes more than a line on a map. It becomes a threshold between life and death. No one from Iam crosses it. No one dares. It is a silent agreement of sacrifice. To protect the world beyond, they will trap death within. Outsiders, led by the Earl of Devonshire from nearby Chatsworth House, step in to provide what they can. Food, medicine, whatever might be needed is left at marked boundary stones. Payment, small coins soaked in vinegar, is dropped into carved hollows in the rock. People believe vinegar purifies, that maybe, just maybe, it can keep the plague from leaping across silver. And so begins one of the most haunting, most heroic stories in the history of human endurance in the face of disease. Seasons change, but the plague does not. Summer fades to autumn. Autumn yields to the stillness of winter. Winter thaws into spring. Yet within Iam, death does not rest. Entire bloodlines vanish. Children bury parents only to fall ill days later. Orphans are made only to be lost themselves. The village becomes a graveyard with roofs. Houses stand hollow. Gardens bloom over shallow graves. Even the churchyard cannot hold the weight of sorrow. And yet within this desolation, the light of individual courage flickers, fragile, unwavering. Elizabeth Hancock lives on the outskirts at Riley Farm. In August 1666, the plague steals her husband, then her 6 children, each one taken within 8 unbearable days. No one comes to help. Neighbors watch from a distance, terrified. And so Elizabeth, driven by a love stronger than grief, carries each body alone to the field. She digs, she buries, 7 graves side by side, all dug by her own hand. No ceremony, no final words, just soil and silence. But what makes her story extraordinary is not just her unimaginable loss, it's the unexplainable fact that she survives. Despite handling the infected bodies of her entire family, Elizabeth never falls ill. Like others before her, she may carry the CCR5 Delta 32 genetic mutation, a silent blessing passed down through generations, unknown to her, but written into her very blood. Today, the Riley graves remain, a quiet monument to sorrow, to strength, to a woman who did not break. And then there is Marshall Howe. Not all heroes are noble. Howe becomes IAM's unofficial gravedigger, not out of duty, but for gain. He steals from the homes of the dead, takes what he can before consigning them to the earth, a scavenger in a village of ghosts, and yet he lives. Again and again, he walks into plague-infested homes, touches the untouchable, carries the lifeless. He should have died 100 times, but he doesn't. His survival, like Elizabeth's, defies reason. It is a cruel twist of fate. The selfless die, and the selfish endure. But even in his darkness, there is something to learn about human nature, about immunity, about the thin, uncertain line between consequence and chance. These stories are not just fragments of history. They are reminders of what we carry, of what we survive, and of what we're willing to sacrifice for others, for hope, for something greater than ourselves. Yet somehow, Marshall Howe survives the entire outbreak, untouched, symptomless, walking through a landscape of death with a body that refuses to fall ill. At the time, it feels like divine mercy, sheer luck, a miracle. But modern science provides another answer, a rare genetic mutation, tiny, invisible, protecting him from the plague by preventing the deadly bacterium from invading his cells. What felt to Howe like God's hand on his shoulder was in truth evolution's quiet intervention, his DNA carrying a secret shield passed down through generations, giving him a silent advantage in the ancient war between humankind and disease. Then there is the quiet tragedy of Emmet Sadal and Roland Tora, 2 young lovers caught in the cruel hands of fate, their devotion tested by walls of quarantine. Emmet lives inside the sealed village of Iam. Roland belongs to the world just beyond it. And when the cordon closes, so does the life they imagine together. But love finds its way. They begin to meet, never close enough to touch, on either side of Cucklet Delf, a ravine that becomes their fragile lifeline. Across the open air, they exchange words, promises, hopes, each glance a reminder of what still exists beyond fear. Through the early months of isolation, these distant meetings become their solace. A few moments stolen from the jaws of despair, until one day, she stops coming. As spring deepens into the heat of summer in 1666 and Iam is swallowed by the plague's fury, Roland waits. He returns day after day, calling her name into the silence, but no answer comes. Not until the quarantine lifts does he learn the truth. Emmet died in April, a bright flame extinguished too soon. Their story ends in heartbreak, but it endures in the memory of a village, in the echo of love that defied even death's distance. And then there is the strangest tale of all, the story of Margaret Blackwell. Struck by the plague, her body burning with fever, she is abandoned by her brother, Francis, left for dead in their home. But Margaret does not die. In a delirious haze, her thirst unbearable, she staggers into the kitchen. There, mistaking a container of bacon fat for milk, she drinks. Thick, greasy, wrong. But she survives. Word spreads, bacon fat cured the plague. For generations, villagers speak her name as proof that salvation can come in the most unexpected forms. But the truth is more likely hidden in her blood. Like Howe, she may have carried the rare mutation that made survival possible, not because of the bacon, but in spite of it. Still, the legend persists, because in a world shattered by disease, even the thinnest threads of hope are clung to like lifelines. Amid it all, the village's spiritual leaders stand as anchors in the storm. William Mompesson and Thomas Stanley, men of faith who together proposed the unthinkable, sealing off Iam to save those beyond its borders. It is an act of courage, yes, but also one of immense personal cost. Mompesson's wife, Catherine, chooses to stay behind with him, caring for the sick, walking into the heart of danger with eyes wide open. In August 1666, the disease takes her. She dies in her husband's arms, a woman of grace and sacrifice. And though Mompesson's body survives the plague, something within him does not. He writes of himself afterward not as a man who lived, but as one who walks through the world hollowed, broken, and forever marked by loss. In a letter to his children, sent away for safety before the quarantine, he wrote with trembling hand, "The condition of this place is very sad. I entreat you to fly this place. I am not in a condition to receive comfort from you. I am so weak I can write no more." It is a cry both of love and resignation, a father's plea, not for help, but for distance. Not to be saved, but to protect them from what he could no longer shield them from. Yet even in the grip of despair, he stayed. Even as grief hollowed him, he continued to minister to the sick, the dying, the terrified. He chose to remain when flight might have saved him. He chose others, again and again, until his own strength gave out. Church services were moved to the open air, held in Cucklet Dell. There beneath the sky, villagers stood scattered across the field, breathing in the wind, afraid to breathe too near each other. What we now call social distancing was then only a desperate intuition that maybe the air moved cleaner outside. And still they came. Even in the shadow of death, they sang hymns, they prayed. Not because it would stop the plague, but because it reminded them of who they were before fear made the world unfamiliar. But humanity, as ever, was not perfect. There were moments of weakness, cracks in the courage. Looters took what was left behind. Neighbors turned away from each other. And one woman, Mary Cooper, fled toward Sheffield, chasing the illusion of safety, only to be caught and brought back. Even desperation, it seems, cannot always outrun duty. Still, these falterings were the exception. The story of Iam is not one of failure. It is one of extraordinary moral strength. A collective vow made not in glory, but in silence. We will stay. We will not carry this death beyond our walls. For 14 months, the plague raged within Iam. By the end, November 1666, only about 340 of the original 800 villagers were still alive. Entire bloodlines vanished. The laughter of children disappeared from certain homes forever, and the fabric of the village, its relationships, its rhythms, its memories, was torn down to threads. But they had done it. The disease stopped with them. Beyond Iam's stone borders, nearby communities remained untouched. Lives, thousands of them, were spared because this one village chose suffering over survival at the cost of others. They did not have science, they had only belief and courage in one another. When the silence returned, it was not peace, it was aftermath. And the survivors, numb with loss, began the painful work of rebuilding. What they could not know, what they could never have imagined, was that their story would echo through the centuries. They could not know that this plague would be the last of its kind in England, that the very bacteria which had ravaged them would, in time, lose its grip. That human understanding of sanitation, of rats, of disease itself, would one day grow strong enough to push the Black Death into the past. Nor could they know that their descendants would become a point of fascination for future scientists, that hidden in their blood would be traces of survival, higher than average rates of a rare genetic mutation, CCR5 delta 32, the same mutation that might once have given a child in Iam a chance to live. Proof written into their DNA that suffering had not been in vain, that nature had noticed their sacrifice and etched it into the future of their bloodline. They could not know any of this, but still, they stayed. And by doing so, they gave the world not just lives saved, but a legacy of what it means to choose love over fear. And they certainly cannot know that their example, quiet, ordinary, desperate, will one day echo across centuries. That in the early 21st century, the world will face a different plague, and once again, communities will be asked to choose isolation or risk, sacrifice or selfishness, the good of many or the comfort of one. They know none of this. All they know is that they have endured something almost beyond comprehension. They have watched neighbors vanish, friends fade, family members die by the dozen. They have lived through sweltering summer heat and bone-deep winter cold, alone, isolated, cloaked in fear and wrapped in grief. And now, as the grip of the plague loosens at last, they stand blinking in the light of survival, unsure what life even means anymore. The people of Am face practical burdens right away. Fields lie fallow, choked with weeds. Shops stand abandoned, shutters broken, doors unlatched, roofs leak, doors rot. So much has crumbled. Entire families are gone. The normal structure of life, of home and kin and shared memory, has collapsed. Orphans must find new arms to hold them. Widows and widowers must choose whether to rebuild love from rubble. Property ownership becomes a riddle when no one is left to inherit. And yet, resilience stirs. The human spirit, bruised but unbroken, begins to reach for life again. New families emerge from the ashes of old ones. Cousins, long unseen, return to claim what is left and bring laughter where only silence has lingered. Those with skills find their labor newly valued. Carpenters, midwives, smiths, those who remain can ask for more, and they are paid. The plague has acted as a cruel, unrelenting form of natural selection. Those who survived, whether through hidden immunity, sheer luck, or the blessings of chance, become the foundation upon which the village begins to rebuild. Their blood carries something invisible and powerful, a legacy that won't be understood for centuries, resistance. But not all wounds are of the body. Elizabeth Hancock, who buried her entire family with her own hands, husband, children, all, will go on to remarry. She will have more children, a new life. But those who live near her say she is never quite whole again. Sometimes her eyes go distant, fixed on something no one else can see, as though in that quiet moment, she's walking that hillside once more, laying her loved ones to rest, one by one. Marshall Howe, the gravedigger who outlived so many, finds survival does not equal absolution. His immunity saves him, but not from memory or judgment. The villagers remember how he rifled through pockets, plucked rings from cold hands. During the crisis, they needed him. Afterward, they recoil. William Merson, shattered by the loss of his beloved Catherine, cannot bear to remain in Ulm. He leaves in 1669, takes a new post, remarries. He lives to 71, but his letters speak of ghosts, of dreams thick with smoke and coughing, of a love lost too soon and never truly replaced. As for Ulm itself, the village breathes again, slowly, steadily. The rhythm of life returns, though some family names are lost forever, their lineages severed by fate. The story of the quarantine becomes more than history, it becomes heritage. A memory carried not just with sorrow, but with pride. A tale of those who stayed, who endured, who gave everything so that others might live. Passed from voice to voice, generation to generation, a legacy born from loss and from love. In the 19th century, as Victorian England cultivates a fascination with poignant chapters of history, Ulm's story is unearthed and brought back into the light. The plague village, as it comes to be known, begins to draw visitors, pilgrims of curiosity, eager to stand where sorrow once lived, the Riley graves, the boundary stones. Simple, weathered, and enduring, these quiet landmarks become unofficial monuments to love, loss, and resilience. By the 21st century, Ulm has found its place on the map of heritage tourism through Derbyshire. But it is not merely a stop on a well-worn route. It is a sacred threshold between past and present. The village museum speaks gently of the plague and the quarantine. The parish church holds within its walls the memory of a community's courage, displaying artifacts, tributes, and time-worn names. Every year since 1866, on Plague Sunday, people gather not just to mourn, but to remember, to honor, to stand in reverent silence for those who chose love over life. And yet, Ulm is not frozen in time. It breathes, it blooms. It remains a living, breathing village, where descendants of those long-ago heroes still walk the same footpaths, tend the same gardens, whisper to the same hills. Some bear the very names etched into gravestones from the 1665-66 outbreak. The Hancocks, the Siddles, the Blackwells. Some carry more than names. Science has discovered the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation in their genes, a biological thread of survival passed down like an inheritance of quiet strength. Ulm's story is not just history, it is humanity. It reminds us that the past is not merely a list of dates and battles. It is the heartbeat of real people, facing unthinkable choices with ordinary hands. People who stood between death and the world beyond their village and chose to close the gate. And as sleep deepens around you like a soft cloak, hold the image of Ulm close. Picture its serene cottages, its blooming gardens, the stillness of a place that once trembled with grief. The stones remain, the graves are carefully tended, and through them the past still speaks, not loudly, but with dignity. The villagers who sealed themselves in did not act for glory. They did not imagine a museum or a Sunday service in their name. They acted for the sake of those beyond the hills, for strangers they would never meet. They made their choice not for legacy, but for love. And perhaps that is what makes their stories so enduring. In a world too often driven by self-interest, Stands as quiet evidence of another truth, that human beings, when it matters most, are capable of astonishing selflessness. Tomorrow night, we will journey further to see how the world emerged from plague's shadow, how societies rebuilt, how the echoes of that resistance still touch our modern bodies and lives. But for now, may the spirit of villagers keep you company as you drift into sleep, a gentle reminder that even in the darkest hours, humanity's light never truly goes out. Now, let us return to the days following the 14th century Black Death. While story from the 1660s shows us the courage of a single village, the great pandemic of the 1300s transformed entire societies. As we drift deeper into this historical dreamscape, let's explore how surviving such catastrophe reshaped the medieval world. Imagine yourself once more in that small village we visited earlier. But now it's 1352. The initial waves of plague have finally subsided, leaving a transformed landscape both physically and socially. As you walk through the village that was once home to 200 souls, you count perhaps 90 people remaining. Empty cottages stand like hollow-eyed skulls along the lane, their thatched roofs beginning to collapse without maintenance, their gardens overgrown with weeds. Yet amid this desolation, subtle signs of change are appearing, changes that will eventually alter the very foundations of medieval society. In the fields surrounding the village, the transformation is immediately visible. Before the plague, every available piece of land was cultivated, even marginal soils that yielded poor harvests. Generations of population growth had pushed farming onto less and less productive terrain, as people desperately tried to produce enough food for growing families. Now, with so many dead, land is suddenly abundant. Survivors abandon the least fertile fields entirely, focusing their labor on the best soils. This simple shift dramatically improves crop yields per person. Where once a peasant family might have struggled to produce enough to feed themselves after paying taxes and tithes, now they often harvest a surplus. For those who survive the apocalyptic mortality, food is more plentiful than it has been in living memory. After centuries of existing on the edge of hunger, this abundance feels miraculous, a small compensation for the emotional devastation of losing so many family members and neighbors. Changes in diet soon follow. Before the plague, most peasants subsisted primarily on grain. Bread, porridge, and ale formed the bulk of their nutrition, with meat as a rare luxury. Now, with fewer mouths to feed and more land available, many convert fields to pasture for raising animals. Meat, cheese, and butter appear more frequently on humble tables. The average height of the population, which had been declining due to poor nutrition, begins to increase again as diets improve. But the most profound changes come in the relationship between workers and landowners. The massive population loss, roughly half of Europe's people, creates an acute labor shortage. Fields still need plowing, crops need harvesting, cloth needs weaving, buildings need repairs. Yet there are simply not enough hands to do all the necessary work. For surviving peasants and artisans, this new reality brings unprecedented leverage. Consider the case of Thomas Fletcher, a plowman in your village. Before the plague, Thomas was like countless others, one man among many, tilling the earth under a sun that showed no favoritism. 6 days a week, he bent his back in service to the local manor, not for wages, but for permission. Permission to farm a modest plot of land to feed his family. He did not complain, not because he lacked grievances, but because he lacked options. Behind him stood a line of other peasants, hungry and willing to take his place without hesitation. But that world is gone. With half the village buried and the manor's fields left untended, everything changes. One morning, the steward himself approaches Thomas, not with demands, but with an offer. A larger plot of land, labor service reduced from 6 days to 3, and most astonishing of all, the freedom to take paid work elsewhere should he choose. It is not generosity, it is desperation. Without Thomas's hands, the earth will not be turned, the grain will not grow. And not just the peasants, but the lord of the manor himself will face hunger. The old hierarchy, once as rigid as stone, now shifts beneath their feet like sand. Scenes like this unfold across Europe. Where once peasants had been bound to the land by law and birthright, they now find something previously unthinkable: leverage. Some landlords, desperate to maintain their estates, offer freedom from serfdom altogether. Others transform forced labor into fixed rent, granting tenants the freedom to farm as they see fit, as long as payment is made. For skilled workers, the transformation is even more dramatic. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, weavers, once overlooked, now essential. Their wages skyrocket. What was once survival becomes comfort. A carpenter who once went to bed hungry now builds a house with 2 rooms and glass windows. His family wears dyed fabrics. They eat meat, not on holidays, but on ordinary days, 3 times a week. To the nobility and merchant elite, it feels like the world is turning upside down. They watch in horror as former serfs walk with heads held high as laborers dine like landowners. The traditional order, so carefully preserved for generations, is unraveling. In panic, authorities act. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers is issued in 1349, followed by the Sweeping Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws attempt to freeze the world in place, to roll back time. Employers are forbidden from offering higher wages. Workers are barred from leaving their villages in search of better prospects. Food prices are fixed by law. Similar laws emerge across Europe. France imposes wage controls. Florence does the same. Castile attempts to halt the migration of peasants with strict labor codes, but none of it truly works. The labor shortage is too deep, the suffering too widespread, and the desire for something better, stronger now in every surviving heart, cannot be legislated away. In the countryside, officials tasked with enforcement quietly look the other way, knowing full well that their own survival depends on the cooperation of the very people these laws aim to control. The plague has shattered more than bodies. It has fractured an entire way of life. And though the dead do not speak, the living are finding their voices. Workers, constrained by post-plague wage controls, begin to respond not with obedience, but ingenuity. A carpenter, forbidden by law from earning more than a set daily wage, might instead be paid with food, clothing, or a roof over his head. A field laborer, officially bound to low wages, might simply work sluggishly or withhold his best effort until offered something more than what the law permits. For the landowners and officials enforcing these laws, the arithmetic is bleak. Where once a lord commanded the labor of 100 peasants, now he may have 50, if he's lucky. Punishing one for insubordination or desertion only tightens the noose of his labor shortage. And besides, if the workers are mistreated, many simply vanish. Legal restrictions on mobility be damned, because they know other estates, towns, or even entire regions will welcome them with open arms and higher pay. The pressure builds until it ruptures. Across Europe, frustration turns into rebellion. In 1358, the countryside near Paris ignites in the Jacquerie Uprising. Peasants, long bowed by feudal oppression, now storm castles and torch noble estates. The rebellion is swiftly and brutally crushed, but its message is unmistakable. The laboring classes are no longer silent, no longer afraid. In England, anger smolders for decades until it finally ignites in 1381. Tens of thousands of peasants rise under the banners of Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, and John Ball, a radical priest who preaches a gospel of equality and defiance. They march on London, demanding an end to serfdom, the repeal of oppressive taxes, and a voice in the world that has long ignored them. John Ball's sermon becomes the soul of their movement. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? It's a question that slices through centuries of hierarchy, exposing the myth of divine privilege. From the beginning, all men were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. His words echo across fields and alleys, giving voice to millions whose suffering has long been cloaked in silence. Though the peasants' revolt, like the Jacquerie, is ultimately crushed through false promises and savage retaliation, it leaves behind something far more enduring than scorched manners or broken laws, a shift in collective consciousness. The peasantry, once resigned to their God-given place, now dares to imagine a different world. Workers who once accepted whatever scraps were offered now understand their worth and are willing to fight for it. And this transformation isn't confined to the countryside. In towns and cities, where death had swept through crowded alleyways with merciless speed, another quiet revolution is unfolding. Urban centers like Florence, which loses up to 75% of its population, become landscapes of grief and of opportunity. The dead leave behind homes, trades, and titles. Housing that once seemed a luxury becomes available to the survivors. Guilds, hollowed out by loss, begin promoting apprentices to master status years ahead of schedule. In the absence of husbands, fathers, and brothers, women step into roles long denied to them, taking over workshops, running businesses, entering professions that once shut them out entirely. From rural fields to cobbled city streets, the world reshapes itself in the wake of devastation. Out of loss, something new is born. A society that may still be fragile, but one that no longer accepts the old rules as sacred. Because once people taste the possibility of change, once they learn their worth, it's nearly impossible to return to silence. Consider the story of Margareta. She is a weaver's widow in a small market town, one of countless women whose quiet lives are transformed not by ambition, but by grief. Before the plague, she worked beside her husband, her hands as skilled as his, yet invisible in the eyes of the law. Guild regulations forbade women from owning workshops or practicing trades independently. She was permitted to assist, nothing more. The loom was his, the name on the ledger his, even though the cloth was often hers. Then the plague comes, and he dies. Margareta is left with his tools, his workshop, his debt, and his craft. She knows the rhythm of the loom, the feel of fibers, the delicate art of turning raw thread into warmth and livelihood. But the guild, with its old rules, stands between her and survival. And yet the Weavers Guild, like so many others across Europe, is not what it once was. Too many members have perished. Demand for cloth is rising. The rules built for a world of abundance are cracking beneath the weight of necessity. So they make a choice, not out of kindness, but survival. They allow Margareta to stay. They admit her. A woman, an artisan. She is not alone. Across Europe, tradition yields to reality. Women step into roles long denied them, not because the world is ready for change, but because the old world has collapsed. For a time, a generation or more, doors creak open that had always been bolted shut. Women run workshops, manage estates, trade goods. Their work is not merely tolerated, it is needed, and so it flourishes. But not only the economy changes. Art, fashion, even the shape of death and the collective imagination transforms. The Black Death does not just hollow towns and families, it hollows out certainty itself. It makes life fragile, and because of that, it becomes precious. In the plague's shadow, a new aesthetic emerges. Death becomes a muse. Artists carve skeletons into stone. They paint death's head into the corners of portraits. They depict nobles and peasants alike waltzing with corpses in the danse macabre, as if to say, you may wear a crown, but you too will kneel before the grave. And yet, paradoxically, this obsession with mortality brings with it a brighter hunger for life. Those who survive begin to dress not just with function, but with flair. They wear color, even in mourning. They drape themselves in velvet, silk, embroidery. If they can afford it, they wear it, even if they're commoners, even if the law says they shouldn't. The nobility, rattled by the rising confidence of the lower classes, try to reassert control. Sumptuary laws dictate what each rank may wear. Silk for the elite, wool for the rest. But enforcement is another matter. In the wake of such death, who has the stomach to scold a prosperous artisan's wife for daring to wear crimson? And then there's the church. For centuries, it was the pillar of medieval life, the keeper of souls, the interpreter of suffering. But during the plague, many of those tasked with spiritual care fled, others stayed and died. Parishes are without shepherds. Monasteries, once centers of knowledge and devotion, become mass graves. And the people are left to ask, if this is divine punishment, why do the innocent perish alongside the wicked? If prayers are the answer, why are the monasteries among the first to fall? The theology that once comforted now collapses under the weight of silence. No priest can explain why one child lives while another dies. No sermon can redeem the sight of a village graveyard full of mothers, fathers, infants, all buried within a month. And so faith fractures. Some grow more devout, clinging to the hope that survival is a sign of favor. Others begin to question, not just the priests, but the structure itself. The plague does not just kill the body, it unsettles the soul, and nothing, not even God's house, feels as solid as it once did. Instead, two divergent paths of faith begin to take shape. Some survivors cling even more tightly to their beliefs, convinced that their survival is a sign of divine favor. They pray harder, they serve more devoutly. Their gratitude becomes a devotion laced with both awe and guilt. Why them? Why were they spared when so many others, perhaps kinder, more faithful, were not? But others look around at the wreckage, the empty churches, the graves full of priests, the silence of heaven, and begin to question. Not just the church, but the very foundations of belief. If God is just, how could this happen? If the priests are his voice, why were they so powerless? For these survivors, the plague doesn't strengthen faith, it fractures it. And in those cracks, something new begins to grow. Curiosity, skepticism, the desire to understand the world beyond doctrine. That questioning spirit, paired with sweeping economic change, sets the stage for something extraordinary. With fewer people alive to feed, clothe, and house, those who remain have more food, more land, more time. The gears of survival slow just enough to allow thought to flourish. Art, science, philosophy, a reawakening of the human mind that will come to be known as the Renaissance begins, not in palaces or churches, but in the stillness after unimaginable loss. Education, once the guarded privilege of nobles and clergy, begins to expand. Merchants who grow wealthy in the new economy want their children to be literate, not just for business, but for pride, for proof of status. Schools begin to appear, not just in cities, but in towns, even large villages. They teach reading and arithmetic alongside the catechism. The mind becomes a tool of ambition as much as salvation. Necessity becomes the mother of invention in the wake of tragedy. With labor scarce and costly, anything that can save time or hands becomes valuable. Watermills, once only used to grind grain, are reinvented to power bellows, swing hammers, full cloth. Machines begin to take over work that once required whole teams of men. And then, there is the book. Before the plague, books were sacred and rare, handwritten by monks over months or years. But now, those monks are gone, or charging too much for their time. The demand for books remains, the supply shrinks, and in that pressure, someone begins to imagine a better way. A machine that could print words, reproduce knowledge, share ideas. The roots of movable type, the technology that will one day change the world, take hold in this post-plague moment of scarcity and innovation. But perhaps the deepest shift is not mechanical or even intellectual, it is psychological. The plague breaks the illusion of permanence. It shows that everything, status, wealth, power, life itself, can vanish overnight. The old belief that the world must remain as it is because it has always been that way begins to crumble. People start to dream of something different, a new kind of society, a new order, new truths. Most of these dreams will never come to pass, but the dreaming itself, the courage to imagine another way, that is the true legacy of the Black Death. And though many of the changes introduced in the wake of the plague prove temporary, something deeper begins to shift, the collective mindset. The psychological wall that once guarded tradition cracks open, and through those fractures, something new begins to grow. Innovations in thought, in technology, in art, and in the very structures of society. Slowly, these seeds will transform medieval Europe into something unrecognizable, the early modern world. But for those living through it, this transformation doesn't feel like a revolution. It feels like survival. It's not history books they're writing, it's grocery lists, repair work, bargaining for wages. Thomas the Plowman doesn't speak of the end of feudalism, he just wants to feed his family. He's negotiating with the steward, not for power, but for better terms, a bit more bread, maybe a patch of dignity. Margarita the Weaver isn't thinking about women's liberation. She's just learned how to keep the loom running on her own because her husband is gone and the children are hungry. She weaves not to challenge the system, but to endure it. And yet, multiplied across towns, valleys, and entire kingdoms, these humble adaptations, these quiet acts of endurance, begin to shift the ground beneath society's feet. Like water that wears down even the strongest stone, the small choices of millions shape something much larger than themselves. Of course, not every outcome is hopeful. For every worker who finds leverage in a labor shortage, there is a landowner watching their estates slip through their fingers. Some manors collapse altogether, too rigid to bend with the changing times. Monasteries that once thrived on donations and tithes struggle to survive. Churches go silent as income dwindles, and charity once offered freely becomes a luxury few can afford. In towns and cities, unrest brews. Young men with sudden income and little supervision grow reckless. Taverns fill, fights break out. Watchmen, few and overworked, can't hold the line. Abandoned farms become hideouts. Lawlessness seeps into the corners left empty by the dead. And the plague does not disappear quietly. It returns, again and again, smaller waves crashing through weakened communities, halting recovery, deepening the grooves carved by the first catastrophe. Not until the late 15th century does Europe's population begin to rise steadily again. And even then, it takes nearly 2 more centuries for many regions to return to their pre-plague numbers. But in that long pause, those generations suspended in demographic winter, change is given time to take root. What could have been a passing disruption becomes permanent architecture. The world forgets how it was and begins to remember only how it is. And for the peasant family we've followed through this journey, the decades after the storm bring something once unimaginable: progress. Your brother, the one who somehow survived when so many did not, grows into a man who owns more land than your father ever dreamed of. A neighboring farm left empty by death becomes his. In the pre-plague world, this would have been unthinkable. Now it is reality, because in this strange new world, grief and opportunity walk side by side. And survival itself becomes a kind of quiet revolution. Your father, whose hands once shaped simple farm tools, now crafts beams for the restoration of the local church. Its stones weathered not just by time, but by silence and sorrow. The work brings purpose, and more than that, it brings pay. Enough to replace the cold dirt beneath your feet with warm wooden planks. Enough to add a second room to your home, giving your family a small measure of space, of dignity. These are not riches, but they are possibilities. And before the plague, such things would have felt unreachable. Your mother, once a child herself who never learned her letters, now teaches you patiently, slowly, as though each word carries both weight and hope. And your sister, already married, already grown, can read. She learned in the household where she served, where her labor bought more than bread. It bought knowledge. Once, for a peasant girl, reading might have seemed as distant as nobility itself. Now it is a skill with power. In this world shaped by absence, education becomes a quiet rebellion, a doorway. One autumn evening, your family huddles close around the hearth, the fire's glow softening the lines on your father's tired face. He looks at you, not with fantasy, but with a kind of fragile hope. Perhaps you could be a clerk, he says. The abbey needs someone who can read and write. The work pays well, and it's easy on the body. Your brother laughs, but kindly. A clerk? From our family? What would grandfather say? And yet, even he cannot quite dismiss the idea, because something has shifted. Once, the stars seemed to dictate your place, fixed, eternal. Now, even the stars seem to shimmer with uncertainty. The old certainties are cracked, and through those cracks, light begins to slip in. As you lie in bed that night, the fire fading and the air cooling, the thought returns again and again. Maybe it's possible. Not because you're dreaming, but because the world is no longer what it was. This may be the true legacy of the Black Death. Not only the empty chairs left behind, not only the shift in labor, the coins earned, the walls rebuilt, but the slow expansion of what people like you are allowed to hope for. In the stillness before dawn, as the world around you holds its breath between what was and what could be, a truth begins to settle. You, a child of peasants, stand quietly at the threshold of something new. You do not yet know the names. Renaissance, Reformation, Revolution, but their roots reach back to your doorstep, to the courage of survivors, to the choices of those who stayed, to the children who learned to read by candlelight in cottages once cloaked in silence. And as this part of our journey ends, we leave you not with answers, but with a question held gently in the firelight: what will you imagine next? But that is a story for our final night together, when we'll explore how the long shadow of the Black Death extends across centuries, influencing art, science, medicine, and society in ways that still shape our world today. As our journey through the lives of plague survivors nears its end, let's lift our gaze. Let's widen our view to see how the ripples from that great wave of death never truly stopped moving, how they still touch us now in ways both visible and hidden. The echoes of this medieval catastrophe still resonate today, in our bodies, in our institutions, in how we understand illness and survival itself. Let's begin with perhaps the most astonishing legacy, the one written in our blood. Remember the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, the small genetic quirk that shielded some people from the plague's grasp? That variation didn't vanish with the last breath of the Black Death. It lived on, passed quietly from parent to child, a silent shield carried into the future, carried, in fact, into us. Fast forward 6 centuries, the late 20th century, another pandemic rises, HIV/AIDS, millions die, fear spreads, and yet something strange emerges. A small number of people, despite repeated exposure to the virus, do not become infected. Scientists dig deeper, and what they find is astonishing. Many of these people carry the very same CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, the same genetic inheritance that once helped medieval Europeans survive Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium. Why? Because both pathogens, separated by centuries and shaped by different eras, use the same doorway into the body, the CCR5 protein. And this mutation, it changes the lock. It bars the entrance. The same molecular adaptation that protected a mother in 1349 could protect a child in 1992. A bridge of survival stretching across the centuries. This revelation didn't just make headlines, it reshaped medical science. Researchers began developing drugs that could block the CCR5 receptor, mimicking the natural mutation. Today, these treatments form a critical part of modern HIV therapy. In a very real, very human way, the survivors of the Black Death helped save lives in a pandemic they could never have imagined. But the story doesn't end with a single mutation. The Black Death didn't just select for one genetic trait. It was an intense crucible of natural selection, likely influencing many aspects of the immune system. Modern Europeans are descended overwhelmingly from those who withstood the plague's fury. And that legacy, written into the very wiring of their immune systems, has consequences we're only beginning to understand. Some scientists believe that the stronger immune responses that helped our ancestors survive the plague may now have a cost. That same heightened sensitivity may predispose some people today to autoimmune diseases, conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, or multiple sclerosis, where the immune system turns inward and attacks the body itself. A cruel irony. What once saved lives may now silently harm them. This is the paradox of survival. Evolution does not care for comfort. It favors what works in the moment. And sometimes the strength that shields us from one threat becomes a shadow we carry into the next. The plague marked the bodies of those who lived through it and shaped the bodies of those who came after. Even now, in the age of microscopes and mRNA, we carry its imprint. We are, in part, children of catastrophe, and somehow that knowledge makes survival feel all the more sacred. These biological links between the past and the present remind us that pandemics are never just a moment in time. They don't simply kill and then fade into historical memory. They leave fingerprints etched into the very DNA of those who survive. They sculpt the future, silently, shaping the human story for centuries, sometimes even millennia after the initial crisis has passed. The Black Death's legacy was not just biological. Its impact rippled through the very fabric of medieval society, altering the social and economic order in ways no one living through it could fully comprehend. Yes, some of the more immediate changes, labor shortages, rising wages, newfound mobility for workers, began to diminish as the population slowly recovered. But other, deeper shifts took root, and some never reversed. Take serfdom, for example. The ancient system that chained peasants to the land, generation after generation, locked in obligation to their lords. Before the plague, it was the norm. After the plague, it began to unravel, especially in Western Europe. Landowners tried to claw back control. They reissued edicts, demanded obedience, tried to restore what had been lost. But the math no longer worked. There was too much land and not enough people. And those who remained had options. Workers began to negotiate. They moved, they resisted, and slowly power shifted. By the end of the Middle Ages, serfdom had withered in many Western regions: England, France, the Low Countries. In its place came new agreements, tenancy contracts that gave peasants more autonomy. They still worked the land, but they did so with dignity, as renters, not as property. Their labor, once demanded, was now bargained for, but not all of Europe walked the same path. In the East, the plague's aftermath led to the opposite result. There, the nobility consolidated power, reasserted control, and even expanded the grip of serfdom. Historians call it the Second Serfdom, a re-entrenchment that would last, in some areas, into the 19th century. While Western Europe moved, however haltingly, toward individual freedom, Eastern Europe deepened its feudal bonds. That divergence, freedom in the West, rigidity in the East, would echo through centuries of development, shaping everything from governance to economic opportunity to revolution. And then there was the Church. The Catholic Church had long stood as the unshakable center of spiritual and intellectual life, but the Black Death shook its foundations. Why did prayers go unanswered? Why did processions and blessings fail to stop the dying? Why did the devout perish alongside the sinful? For many, the silence in the face of suffering became impossible to ignore. Those who had once accepted suffering as divine punishment began to ask harder questions, questions the Church could not answer. And in that silence, cracks appeared in the stone. In the generations that followed, those cracks would widen. By the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation would break through with force. Reformers challenged the Church's authority, demanded individual access to Scripture, and offered a new spiritual path, one rooted not in hierarchy, but in personal conviction. And the seeds of that revolution? They were sown in the plague years, when ordinary people began to look at power, spiritual and earthly, and wonder whether it was truly sacred or simply assumed. In the wake of plague, both body and belief were transformed. And though centuries have passed, those transformations are still with us. They live in our institutions, our ideas, our freedoms, and perhaps most profoundly in our collective memory of what it means to endure. While the Reformation had many roots, historians trace one of its quietest seeds to the deep disillusionment sown by the plague. After witnessing the Church's powerlessness in the face of suffering, after watching the most faithful perish alongside the most reviled, millions would eventually find the courage to question what had once been unquestionable. The authority of tradition, so long wrapped in sacredness, began to unravel thread by thread. Even the way people created and saw art changed. Before the Black Death, medieval artwork had been almost singular in focus, religious reverence. Paintings and frescoes told the stories of saints, angels, and holy suffering. But after the plague, a darker honesty crept into the canvas. Suddenly, death was not just the domain of the sinful or the damned. It came for all. And so the dance of death emerged. Skeletal figures leading kings and peasants alike to their graves, equalized in the final moment. Still life paintings began to include reminders of mortality, wilting flowers, extinguished candles, bones laid beside banquet tables. These were not just symbols, they were memories, grief captured in brushstrokes. And with this artistic shift came something even more profound, a turn toward the human. Humanism began to stir, an awakening interest in the lived experience, in human emotion, in the mind and its capacities. No longer was art solely about heaven, it was about life on earth. The Renaissance would rise on this new foundation, reclaiming classical Greek and Roman knowledge, but infusing it with the wisdom, sorrow, and resilience born from plague-struck generations. This transformation didn't stop with philosophy or painting. It reached even into the words we use. The legacy of the plague lingers in our language like ghost prints. Take quarantine. From the Italian quarantina giorni, 40 days, it was the length of time ships had to remain anchored, isolated in Venetian harbors before disembarking during plague outbreaks. A word born not from theory, but from desperate experience, or deadline. Today it means a due date, a finish line. But its roots trace back to a far grimmer boundary, a literal line around plague zones or prisons, beyond which stepping could mean death. Even the songs we sing to children may carry echoes of death disguised in rhythm. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Some believe this nursery rhyme is a haunting memory of plague life. The rosy rash, the posies clutched for protection against the stench of decay, the ashes of the burned dead, and the final collapse. While scholars debate the accuracy of that interpretation, its very plausibility reveals something striking, how deeply the Black Death burrowed into our collective memory, even into our lullabies. But perhaps the most lasting transformation was in how humanity viewed disease itself. Before the plague, illness was explained away, either as divine punishment for sin or an imbalance of the body's humors, mysterious and moral rather than medical. But the sheer scale of the Black Death, its indiscriminate cruelty, forced a shift. People began to notice patterns, that proximity mattered, that the sick could infect the well. The earliest whispers of contagion, of science, began to murmur through the silence left by prayers that had gone unanswered. And from that silence, a new kind of knowledge would one day rise. The plague's obvious pattern of spread, moving along trade routes, passing from person to person in close contact, made it impossible to ignore the contagious nature of at least some diseases. Communities developed practical responses that, while not based on germ theory, which would not emerge until the 19th century, nonetheless incorporated effective public health measures. Ships were quarantined. Infected households were isolated. Plague victims and their belongings were often burned. Cities appointed public health boards with extraordinary powers during outbreaks, establishing principles of epidemic management that would influence public health practices for centuries. These pragmatic approaches, developed through bitter experience rather than scientific understanding, saved countless lives in subsequent plague outbreaks. By the time the last major European plague epidemic struck Marseille in 1720, authorities had learned to implement cordons sanitaires, strict quarantines and careful monitoring that successfully limited the outbreak largely to that city and its surrounding areas. Such measures came too late for the millions who perished in the initial pandemic, of course. But the knowledge gained from the Black Death experience helped mitigate later outbreaks of plague and informed responses to other epidemic diseases. When cholera struck Europe in the 19th century, public health officials drew on plague management traditions to contain its spread, imperfectly at first, but with increasing effectiveness as scientific understanding improved. The plague's legacy extends even to modern pandemic management. Many of the approaches employed during recent COVID-19 outbreaks, quarantines, travel restrictions, contact tracing, isolation of the infected, have roots in methods developed centuries ago in response to the Black Death. Even the tension between economic impacts and public health measures echoes medieval debates about whether to close city gates and markets during plague outbreaks. Perhaps most profoundly, the Black Death experience shaped how humans think about catastrophe itself. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where sudden disaster seemed ever present. War, famine, and smaller disease outbreaks regularly claimed lives, but the scale and speed of the plague surpassed anything in living memory or recorded history. This encounter with near-apocalyptic mortality forced a kind of collective psychological adjustment. Communities that endured the plague discovered something extraordinary, something they never asked for but would come to carry with quiet strength, the knowledge that survival is possible, even in the face of unthinkable loss. Families were torn apart, villages emptied, the very fabric of daily life unraveled, and yet life, somehow, went on. In the ashes of grief, individuals unearthed a resilience they never knew was there. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but shows up silently when there's no one left to lean on, when everything familiar is gone, and still you wake up and plant the seeds. You feed the children, you bury the dead, and then you build again. Societies too learned, patterns emerged, institutions adapted, practices shifted, not always immediately, not always perfectly, but slowly like water shaping stone. The trauma carved its memory into culture, into laws, into the very ways communities prepared for what might come next. And this, the quiet strength to endure, to adapt, to remember without being paralyzed by the remembering, is one of humanity's greatest gifts. Time and again, history bears witness to this cycle. Pompeii turned to ash in an instant. Lisbon, shattered by a quake and then a wave. The pandemic of 1918, sweeping through cities like wind through dry leaves. And even now, in our own time, fires, floods, new viruses, old fears reborn in modern form. Still, humanity presses forward, grieving, rebuilding, carrying the weight of what was lost while reaching toward what might still be made. The Black Death, perhaps the most brutal of all these calamities, stripped the world bare. But in doing so, it also revealed the raw core of what it means to be human, the ability to suffer deeply and yet continue, to transform pain into progress, to shape new life from the ruins of the old. This is not a romanticization of tragedy. Nothing can soften the reality of what was taken. Each life lost was a world unto itself, a tapestry of memory, possibility, and love cut short without mercy. No societal advancement, no future resilience can erase the cost. And yet the legacy of those who endured matters, because in their endurance they left us a map, not of how to avoid catastrophe, but of how to walk through it without losing ourselves entirely. And so, as we confront our own era of upheaval. Climate uncertainty, global pandemics, fractured systems, and rapid change, we do so not as the first, but as the next. The next in a long line of survivors, of rebuilders, of makers of meaning from loss. Thomas the Plowman never imagined that better wages might mark the beginning of feudalism's end. Elizabeth Hancock, laying her loved ones to rest on a hillside, could not have known that something in her blood might echo centuries later as protection against another disease. But these ordinary lives, lived in extraordinary times, helped shape a future. That is how history moves, not only through the grand designs of kings and empires, but through the quiet courage of those who choose, again and again, to keep going. This is how history often unfolds, not solely in the grand proclamations of kings or the sweeping actions of generals, but in the quiet, determined choices of ordinary people. It is shaped by countless unnamed individuals responding to unimaginable circumstances with whatever strength, creativity, or courage they can muster. As we reach the end of our journey through the world of plague survivors, we're left with questions, some timeless, some urgent. What lessons remain? What echoes still speak to us across the centuries? Perhaps the first is this: human resilience is astonishing. The Black Death dealt a blow so massive it nearly defies comprehension. In some regions, half the population vanished, entire villages disappeared, families erased, and with them, languages, songs, rituals, whole lifetimes of memory and meaning gone. Yet somehow those who remained chose to keep going. They did more than survive, they rebuilt. They formed new communities out of ashes. They loved again, worked again, dreamed again. In the face of devastation, they created a future. And in that act alone, there is something profoundly sacred. There is also a quieter, more unsettling truth the plague reveals. Catastrophe, as much as it wounds, also opens doors. It fractures systems once believed eternal. The rigid class hierarchies of medieval Europe, long seen as part of the natural order, were upended by the demographic reality that followed the plague. Laborers became scarce. Power dynamics shifted. People once locked into roles by birth began to glimpse new paths forward. This doesn't mean we should welcome disaster as a means of progress, but it does remind us that change, real, structural change, is often born from rupture. The plague also urges us to reflect on the deep biological web in which we live. We like to imagine ourselves as separate, above nature. But the truth is, we are participants in a vast, invisible ecosystem. Yersinia pestis, a microbe too small to see, reshaped the human story. It didn't just take lives, it altered genetics, economies, spiritual beliefs. It forced us into new relationships with one another and the world around us. Other microbes have done the same. They always will. We are never truly alone in our bodies, our cities, our histories. We live in constant relationship with each other and with life forms that both sustain and imperil us. And perhaps above all, the plague story teaches us something about mortality, not to fear it, but to see it clearly. Medieval Europeans lived with death in ways modern people often do not. They heard its footsteps daily. The plague only magnified this awareness. But out of that intimacy with loss came a sharpened reverence for life. Art, music, and writing from the period remind us how precious breath is, how quickly everything can change, how fragile and luminous the present moment truly is. This awareness doesn't have to be dark. It can be grounding. It can be beautiful. To understand that we are vulnerable is to understand that we are alive. And to remember the people who came before us, not as statistics or footnotes, but as real human beings navigating terror and love and loss, is to remember ourselves more deeply. The plague did not just destroy, it revealed, it transformed, and it left behind a whisper that even in the face of death, we endure, and in enduring, we become something new. Indeed, many who survived the plague embraced life with a renewed appreciation, shaped by the visceral understanding of how quickly and how unexpectedly it could all end. There is a quiet wisdom in this perspective. It is not born of fear nor a morbid fixation on death. Rather, it is a clear-eyed recognition of life's extraordinary value, precisely because it is fragile, fleeting, uncertain. And now, as our story draws to a close and sleep gently approaches, imagine that medieval village once more, the one we first stepped into together. It is a generation later. The sounds of grief have faded, replaced by the laughter of children playing in streets where silence once ruled. Families fill cottages that once stood hollow with loss. Life, slowly but surely, has returned. The survivors, those who once buried loved ones, who once wondered if they too would see another sunrise, are now elders. Their hair is silvered, their hands worn by time, their eyes still carrying the shadow of what they saw. They remember, not just the terror and pain, but the resilience, the compassion, the small, defiant acts of courage that carried them through. They do not know, could never know, how their choices and endurance would ripple across centuries, how their suffering would shape genetics, society, science, and spirit. They did not live to change history. They simply lived as best they could, with what they had in a world they never asked for. And maybe that is the most profound truth to carry with us into rest tonight, that we, too, possess those same quiet resources, resilience we may not recognize, strength that waits in us like a seed in winter, blooming only when the season demands it. That even in the darkest hours, life insists on returning. It finds cracks in the rubble, paths through the ruins, it rebuilds, it continues. The survivors of the Black Death could never have dreamed of a world like ours, just as we cannot fully imagine the world yet to come. But like them, we stand in a fragile moment, both wounded by the past and gifted with its wisdom. Like them, we move forward. So sleep well tonight. You are part of something vast and ancient, a living thread in the long unfolding fabric of human history, connected to those who came before and to those who will one day walk in your footsteps. Each generation like a chapter, each shaped by challenge, each rising in its own way. And through it all, the story continues. As we come to the end of this journey through one of the darkest and most transformative chapters in human history, we invite you to pause and reflect. Did this story move you? Did it leave you thinking differently about survival, resilience, and the power of human transformation in the face of unimaginable loss? We would love to hear your thoughts. Which part of this story stayed with you the most? What lessons will you carry forward? If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to leave a comment below. We read every one. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more stories that speak to the soul. Until next time, take care of your heart, rest well, and may your dreams tonight be peaceful and kind. Good night.